Now there are men in this world who measure a soul by the cut of its coat, and Cal Hadley was one of them. You could have set your watch by his certainties. He stood there in the middle of that dusty trading yard, the harsh noon sun carving his face into hard angles, and when somebody mentioned the woman who'd taken the old Pruitt homestead up the North Fork of the valley, his lips curled into that smirk I came to know so well in the stories folks told afterward. Pale blue eyes, the color of ice over a shallow creek, slid sideways and away, the way a man's eyes do when he's already decided a thing isn't worth the trouble of looking at straight. Plain, he called her. Plain and quiet, like that was the whole of it. Like a person could be summed up and shelved away in two small words. The dust motes hung in the air beside his jaw, floating slow in that dry mountain light. And he let them hang there while he turned his attention to matters he reckoned more important. Cattle prices, fence lines, the state of his own considerable holdings. He had 300 head and a hired crew and a name that carried weight from one end of the basin to the other, and a man with all that don't generally trouble himself over a widow woman alone on a hard-scrabble patch of ground. She doesn't talk much, somebody offered, half in her defense, and Cal just nodded like that settled it. Doesn't talk much, as if the loudest men in any country were ever the ones worth listening to. As if the still waters didn't run the deepest of all. He couldn't have told you the color of her eyes if you'd put a gun to his head, for he'd never once bothered to meet them. He'd seen her maybe twice, passing on the road, a tall, angular figure in a faded gray dress, her chin level, and her gaze fixed on the middle distance, and he'd tipped his hat the way a man does out of reflex. That was Cal Hadley in those early days. A man so sure of the shape of his world that he'd left no room in it for surprise. And the trouble with certainty, friends, the deep and abiding trouble with it, is that the world has a way of testing it. It comes for the certain man, not with thunder, but with quiet, with the slow accumulation of small truths he failed to notice while he was busy being right. Cal didn't know it yet, standing there in that yard with the smirk still on his lips and the dust still floating beside his jaw. But the valley had already begun to turn on its hinge. The wheels were already moving, slow and patient as the seasons, and they would carry every soul in that high country, sooner or later, up the North Fork to a door he'd never once considered worth knocking on. He thought he had her measured. He thought wrong. And the measuring of Cal Hadley, the long, humbling, hat-in-hand education of a proud man. Well, that's the story I've sat down to tell you tonight, the way it was told to me, around a fire much like this one. So, settle in. Let the coffee go warm in your hands. Because the woman he dismissed as plain and quiet was about to become the most sought-after soul in that whole wide valley, and she did it without raising her voice once. While Cal was busy not looking at her, Nora Vance was at her work, and her work never stopped. Up under the eave of that adobe homestead, in the shade where the heat of the day couldn't reach, she'd built herself a drying rack of split cedar and rawhide cord, and from it hung the whole green and silver wealth of the high desert. There was yarrow gathered from the rocky slopes, its flat white flower heads going brittle and pale. There was sage in fat gray bundles, and feverfew, and the bitter willow bark she'd stripped down by the creek in the cool of morning. Her hands moved among it all with a sureness that came from 10,000 repetitions, fingers brown and nicked and strong, tying a fresh bundle of yarrow with a length of rough twine, her thumb pressing the knot tight against the stems. She didn't hurry. She never hurried. There was a rhythm to her, the way there's a rhythm to a creek finding its way down a mountain, and you got the sense, watching her, that she'd long ago made peace with the truth that some things cannot be rushed and shouldn't be. Her gray eyes were cast downward, calm and focused, gathering up the small details that careless folks overlooked. Which leaf had gone too far, which bundle wanted another day in the air, which root had the strength in it, and which had given all it had. Behind her elbow, open on the plank shelf, lay the leather-bound journal that was the true heart of her trade, though Cal Hadley wouldn't have known it from a feed ledger. She'd kept that journal for the better part of 20 years, since she was a girl in Missouri at her grandmother's knee, learning the names of plants the way other children learned their letters. Every page was crowded with her cramped, deliberate hand, recipes and remedies, the proper poultice for a snake bite, and the right tea to break a fever, how to set a bone, and how to draw the poison from a festering wound. There were notes in there written by lamplight after long nights at sickbeds, observations of what had worked and what had failed, the hard-won knowledge of a woman who had buried her own husband to a fever she couldn't break and had sworn, standing over his grave, that she would never again stand helpless before suffering she might have eased. That was the engine of her. You see, not ambition, not the wish to be admired, for she cared nothing for admiration. It was a kind of stubborn covenant she'd made with the living and the dead both. She would keep learning until she drew her last breath, and so she filled her drying rack and filled her journal and asked nothing of anyone, content in the deep quiet of useful work. The neighbors who knew her, the few who'd had cause, spoke of her in low and careful tones, the way you speak of something rare. But most of the valley, like Cal, knew her only as a shape on the road, a plain woman in a gray dress, and they let her be. She preferred it that way, mostly. The tying of the yarrow, the smell of the drying sage, the long golden afternoons under the eave, with no sound but the wind and her own steady breathing, there was a sufficiency in it that the loud world could not give her. She did not need them, not yet. But the day was coming, faster than any of them knew, when they would all of them need her, and need her badly, and on that day, the plain, quiet woman with the brown hands would be the difference between life and death. There were nights when the homestead had gone still, and the only light was the low orange flame of the lamp on the rough timber table, that Nora sat with her journal spread flat before her, and the whole of her life laid open across those crowded pages. The lamplight warmed the left side of her face, throwing the angles of it into soft relief, the high cheekbone, the long jaw, the thin pale line of an old scar that ran down beside her mouth, a scar she never explained and nobody ever had the nerve to ask after. She held a stub of pencil between two fingers, worn down nearly to nothing, for she was not a wasteful woman, and a pencil was a pencil until there was no more of it to hold. At the table's edge sat the battered tin medicine chest, its lid thrown back, and the lamplight caught in the row of small glass vials within, and turned them to amber jewels. Tinctures and syrups and dark oils she'd rendered herself, each one labeled in her careful hand, each one a small bottle promise against the day it would be needed. She was writing, that night, as so many nights, working through a problem the way another person might worry a loose tooth. A child 2 ridges over had a cough that wouldn't quit, a deep, wet rattle she didn't like the sound of, and she was turning over in her mind everything she knew, every remedy her grandmother had taught, and every one she'd discovered since, weighing them one against another. Mullein for the lungs. Surely. Honey if there was any to be had. But there was something underneath the cough she couldn't quite name, and naming it was the whole of the battle. You did not cure what you could not name. So, She sat, and she thought, and she wrote, the pencil scratching faint in the silence, the lamp guttering low. This was the part of her trade that no one ever saw, the part Cal Hadley couldn't have imagined if he'd tried. The long, solitary labor of the mind, the patient assembling of knowledge into wisdom. Anyone can read a recipe off a page, but to look at a suffering body and know, truly know, what ails it and what will mend it, that is a thing that costs years and costs grief and costs the kind of relentless, humble study that most folks haven't the patience for. Nora had paid the price, was paying it still, every night at this table. She thought sometimes of her husband Tom, dead these 8 years, and of how she'd sat just like this beside his bed, in the last hours, her journal, then near empty, her knowledge a child's, compared to what it had become, and how she'd watched the life go out of him, slow as a sunset, and known with terrible certainty that somewhere in the world was the knowing that would have saved him, and that she did not possess it. That was the wound under all the others. That was the scar you couldn't see. And so she filled the pages, vial by vial, and night by night, building against the dark the only fortress she trusted. Not gold, not land, not a man's strong arm, but knowing. She closed the journal at last, when the lamp burned too low to read by, and she sat a moment in the dark, with her hand flat upon its worn cover, the way a body rests a hand on something living. Then she went to her bed, and slept the deep, clean sleep of the genuinely tired, and outside the wind moved over the valley, and somewhere a child coughed. In the night, and somewhere a man slept easy in his certainties, neither of them knowing that the woman who would soon hold their fates in her 2 brown hands was already quietly ready. The valley itself was a thing worth pausing on, for it shaped every soul that lived in it, the way water shapes stone. Come down off the high pass, and you'd see it spread below you, in the long gold light of evening, a wide bowl of land, cupped between 2 ranges of dry mountains, the floor of it pale with scrub and sage and bunch grass, the earth gone, the color of old bone, and cracked in 1,000 places where the sun had baked it through. It was beautiful country, and it was hard country, and out here, those 2 things were generally the same thing, wearing different faces. There was a single dirt trail that cut across that valley floor, winding up from the south, where it met the wagon road, and running north toward the scattering of homesteads that clung to the foothills, wherever a man could find water. That trail was the artery of the whole community, such as it was. Down it came the supplies, and the news, and the rare traveler. Up it went the harvests, and the cattle, and the dead, when there were dead to carry to the little fenced burying ground near the church. Folks lived far apart in that country, a man's nearest neighbor, often an hour's hard ride distant, and there was a loneliness baked into the place as deep as the cracks in the earth. When trouble came, and trouble always came in the shape of fever or accident or the slow grinding poverty of a bad year, a body had only his own 2 hands and whatever help his scattered neighbors could be persuaded to give. There was no doctor. The nearest Sawbones was in the railhead town, 2 full days' ride to the east, and by the time you fetched him, if he'd come at all, the matter was generally settled one way or the other. So the people of that valley had learned to make do, to set their own bones, and birth their own children, and bury their own dead, and they had learned, too, the names of those few among them who knew a little more than the rest. That golden evening, with the long light raking low across the scrub and the adobe homestead, glowing small and warm at the center of it, all the valley looked at peace. But peace in that country was always a borrowed thing. Far up the trail, where it bent around a shoulder of rock, a thin plume of dust was rising, the kind a single rider raises when he's pushing his horse harder than is wise. Nobody pushes a horse like that in the cool of evening, unless something has gone wrong. The dust hung in the still air and drifted slow, and if you'd been standing on that pass, you might have watched it come and felt the small, cold knowledge settle in your chest that somewhere down there, a life had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The homestead glowed on, unaware, the herb rack a dark shape under its eave, the lamp not yet lit. And this is how it begins, friends, the way it always begins, not with a trumpet, but with a rising of dust, a rider in a hurry, and need too large to be borne alone. The valley had gone for years, not knowing what it had in the plain, quiet woman on the North Fork. It was about to find out. The rider came on, and the dust rose, and the evening light lay golden and indifferent over the whole hard, beautiful country. And Nora Vance, inside her adobe walls, set down her supper and lifted her head, for even before the hoofbeats reached her ears, she had felt it the way folks who live close to the land learn to feel things. The change in the air, the coming of a need that had her name on it. She wiped her hands. She did not hurry, but she was already moving toward the door. The first one to come up the North Fork in earnest was a man named Eli Sutter, and he came with his hat gone and his eyes wild, and his boy slung across the saddle in front of him, white as ash. Nora heard the horse before she saw it, the desperate, uneven drumming of it on the hard trail, and she was at the door with her hand braced on the worn plank before Eli had even hauled the lathered animal to a stop in her yard. She filled that doorway, tall and still and unsurprised, the late afternoon light flooding past her from inside, so that it caught the bone handle of the knife at her belt and the row of vials in the open tin chest on the shelf within easy reach. Her gray eyes took in the whole of it in a single sweep, the boy's color, and the way he held his arm, and the dark stains spreading at his trouser leg, and where another woman might have cried out or wrung her hands, Nora only said in that low, even voice of hers, "Bring him in." Ellie was babbling. There'd been an accident at the well. The bucket frame had come down. His boy's leg was crushed, and there was a gash to the bone, and the blood wouldn't stop, and the doctor was 2 days off, and Lord, please, somebody had said, she knew things. She had to do something. And all the while she was clearing the table with one sweep of her arm and spreading a clean cloth and rolling her sleeves to the elbow. "Hush!" Now she told him, not unkind, just firm, the way you'd speak to a spooked horse. "You did right to come. Now hush, and let me work and answer what I ask you." And something in the iron calm of her steadied the man even in his terror. He laid the boy down. The child was barely conscious, moaning low, and Nora put her 2 hands on him, gentle as a mother, and went, still reading him through her fingertips the way she read everything, and you could see her mind working behind those gray eyes, swift and sure. This was the work she'd been born for, the work she'd grieved her way into and studied her way toward across 20 hard years. And now that it was before her, she met it without a flicker of doubt. She knew this. She had written this very thing in her journal not 3 pages from the end. A crushed limb, the bleeding to be stopped first, and the cleaning second, and the setting third, and the order of it mattering more than anything, for a man could die of the wrong order as easy as the wrong remedy. She reached without looking, and her hand fell on exactly the vial she wanted, and the bone-handled knife came off her belt to cut away the ruined trouser leg, and she went to work. Eli stood back, against the wall, his hat in his hands, watching the plain, quiet woman he'd been half ashamed to come begging to. And what he saw in the next hour he would talk about for the rest of his days. He'd expected, he admitted later, some hedge-witch fumbling, some old wives' nonsense, a prayer and a poultice, and the boy likely dead by morning. What he got instead was something nearer to a miracle, and nearer still to a mastery, a woman who moved through blood and crisis with the unshakable competence of a battlefield surgeon who knew the name of everything she did. By the time the lamp was lit, the bleeding was stopped, and the wound was clean, and the bone was set and bound, and the boy, washed gray-pale but breathing easy, had fallen into a true sleep. And Eli Sutter, his throat working, asked her what he owed. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him level and said, "Only, bring me some of your wife's good honey when the boy's on his feet. That'll square it." Word travels in a wide country faster than you'd credit, faster than the fastest horse, because it travels on a thing that needs no resting and eats no oats. It travels on need and on wonder and on the tongues of grateful folk. Eli Sutter's boy mended clean and walked again on a leg that any doctor would have taken off at the knee, and Eli was not a man to keep such a thing to himself. He told it at the trading post, and he told it at the church, and he told it to every soul he passed on the road, the story of the plain, quiet woman on the North Fork who'd brought his son back from the very lip of the grave with nothing but her 2 brown hands and a tin chest full of herbs. And so they began to come. They came one at a time at first, hesitant, half ashamed, the way folks come to a thing they don't rightly understand. A woman with a baby that wouldn't take to nursing. An old man whose breath had gone short and rattling, a young wife, pale and frightened, with a sickness she couldn't name and dared not name to her husband. A cowhand kicked in the chest by a green-broke horse. His ribs caved and his lips blew. They came up the North Fork in the cool of morning and the heat of noon and the dark of night, and Nora took every one of them in. You'd find her, in those weeks, with her leather apron faintly stained with the green and amber pigments of her trade, her hands pressing a folded cloth compressed to a fevered brow with steady, unhurried precision, her jaw set in that quiet authority that asked no permission. There, at the edge of everything she did, sat the open tin medicine chest and a sprig of gray sage, the tools of her covenant laid out like a craftsman's tools, which is exactly what they were. She did not perform. She asked her careful questions, and she laid on her careful hands, and she reached into her journal, and her memory both, and she gave to each one exactly what they needed, and not a grain more. And when it was done, she named her price, which was never money, for she had little use for it and less trust. "Bring me eggs. Bring me a length of good cloth. Come help me. Strip willow bark in the spring. Tell me when you've a moment how your mother's people treated the croup, for I'd learn it." She traded in things, and in knowing and in the slow weaving of herself into the fabric of the valley, though she'd have laughed if you'd put it to her that way, for she still thought of herself as a solitary woman who simply did what wanted doing. But the valley was learning her name now, and learning it with a kind of reverence that made the old hands shake their heads in wonder. Children who'd been carried to her white and limp ran past her gate now and waved. Women who'd never spoken to her stopped to ask her counsel on this and that, and stayed to talk and went home lighter for it. The lonely, scattered souls of that hard country had found, almost without noticing it happen, a center, a still point, a place where help could be had and grief could be eased, and wisdom could be drawn upon freely. And all of it ran through one plain, quiet woman who'd asked nothing of any of them but to be left to her work, and who now found her days fuller than they'd ever been, and her heart, though she'd never have said so aloud, fuller too. She did not crave their need, but she did not turn it away. And in the not turning away, she became, day by day and life by life, the most indispensable soul for 50 miles in any direction. The one proud rancher down the valley still had not heard a single word of it. But he heard it at last, the way the last man in any country always hears the thing everyone else already knows. Cal Hadley was mending fence on the south boundary of his land one cool morning, his big hands working the wire, when two of his hired men fell to talking nearby, not troubling to lower their voices, for it never occurred to them their boss would care. One was telling the other about his sister, how she'd been poorly all winter, how the women had finally taken her up to the Vance place on the North Fork, and how she'd come home a week later, near to her old self, and how she swore by that woman now, and so did half the valley, and how a body couldn't hardly get an audience with her anymore for the line of folks at her door. The other man nodded and said he'd heard the same, that she'd saved the Sutter boy's leg and pulled old Wheeler back from the pneumonia, and that there wasn't a soul in the basin now who didn't owe her something or know somebody who did. Cal's hands went still on the wire. He stood up slow, and he turned and he looked off down the long gold sweep of the valley, toward the North Fork, where the adobe homestead sat small and distant against the foothills. And for the first time in his life, he looked at it as though it mattered. His iron-gray mustache drew tight. His pale blue eyes, that had slid away from her so easily that day in the trading yard, now fixed on that far-off speck of a homestead, and would not let it go. He pushed his wide-brimmed hat back on his head, a small thing, that, but the men who knew him knew it for what it was. A crack in the granite of his assurance, the gesture of a man knocked off the comfortable footing of his certainties. One large hand came to rest uneasy on the top rail of the fence, and he stood there a long while, not saying anything, while his hired men drifted off to their work and left him to his thoughts. And his thoughts, friends, were not easy ones. For Cal Hadley was not a stupid man, only a proud one, and there is a vast difference between the two, though they're often mistaken for each other. A stupid man can hear a truth like that and let it slide off him. A proud man hears it and feels it lodge, feels the slow turning in his gut, as the picture he'd carried of the world cracks and shifts and rearranges itself into a shape he doesn't recognize. Plain and quiet, he'd called her. Plain and quiet, like that was the whole of it. And now here was the whole valley, his valley, the country he'd ruled with his cattle and his name and his easy certainties for 15 years. Here was the whole of it, turned toward a door he'd never knocked on, drawing strength and life and comfort from a well he'd never once thought to look into. He thought of all the times he'd ridden past her on the road and tipped his hat without seeing her. He thought of the smirk he'd worn. And he found, to his considerable discomfort, that he could not quite remember the color of her eyes, and that this not remembering shamed him in a way he could not have explained to a living soul. A man builds his whole sense of himself on knowing his own country, on having the measure of every soul in it. And Cal had just discovered, standing at his own fence in the cool of the morning, that the most important person for 50 miles around had been there the whole time, in plain sight, and he had been too sure of himself to see her. He stood at that rail until the sun climbed high and the chill burned off the day. And then he turned and went back to his work. But something in him had shifted on its foundation, and would not settle, and would not let him be. If you'd walked up to that plank door on the North Fork in those weeks and looked down at the threshold before you knocked, you'd have read the whole story without needing a word from anyone, for the valley had begun to speak to Nora Vance in the only language it knew. There, along the worn wood, where the low gold light of evening came raking in across the grain, lay the offerings, a folded square of clean cloth, good linen, the kind a woman parts with only out of real gratitude. A tied bundle of dried sage, gathered and bound by some other hand than Nora's, left for her use. A smooth river stone, gray and water-worn, the sort a child might carry in a pocket for luck and leave behind as the only treasure he owned worth giving. There were eggs in a little nest of straw. There was a twist of paper holding precious sugar. There was a wood-carved spoon, sanded smooth, made over long winter evenings by a man with nothing else to give but his hands and his time. None of these things had a name attached. None of them needed one. They were left in the night and the early morning, set down quiet by folks who didn't want to trouble her, who only wanted, in whatever small way they could manage, to close the circle of obligation that her kindness had opened. And this, you understand, was a richer payment than any gold could have been. For gold can be spent and forgotten. But these humble tokens spoke of a thing far harder to come by in that lonely country. Nora found them each morning when she opened her door to the day, and she gathered them up gentle in her two brown hands. And though her face never gave much away, there were mornings the old scar by her mouth pulled at something when she smiled, just slightly. She had come to this valley, a stranger and a widow, asking nothing, expecting nothing, content to live alone with her journal and her herbs and her quiet covenant with the suffering. And somehow, without ever meaning to, without ever once raising her voice, or pushing herself forward, or asking for a single soul's regard, she had become woven into the very heart of the place. The threshold, full of gifts, was the proof of it, plain as print. Every cloth and stone and egg was a thread, and the threads together made a fabric, and the fabric was her belonging, stitched by the hands of folk who'd had nothing else to stitch it with. She thought, gathering them, of her husband Tom, dead and gone these years, and of how she believed, standing at his grave, that she would walk the rest of her road alone and unattached, a useful stranger. She had been wrong about that, and she was glad of it, gladder than she'd let herself know. There is a particular loneliness in being needed by no one, and she had carried it so long she'd stopped feeling its weight, the way you stop feeling a stone you've carried in your pocket for years. The gifts on the threshold lifted that weight, one small token at a time. She took them inside, every one. The cloth she folded into her chest of supplies, the sage she hung on her rack. The river stone she set on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, and there it stayed for the rest of her days, a small gray thing of no value at all and beyond all price. And the giving did not stop. Week upon week, the threshold never quite empty, the valley speaking its silent thanks in the only tongue it had, until the morning came when one more figure climbed the North Fork to her door. And this one came, not to leave a gift, but to give back something he'd taken without ever knowing. He came in the late afternoon, when the light had gone long and amber across the valley, and Nora heard the horse and knew the gait of it before she saw the rider, for she'd learned every hoofbeat in that country by now. She stood in her open doorway with the leather journal tucked under one arm and her other hand resting easy on the doorframe, and she watched Cal Hadley swing down from his saddle in her yard and walk toward her with his wide-brimmed hat already off and held in both his big hands against his chest. That alone told her most of what she needed to know. A man like Cal did not bare his head for just anyone. He came to a stop, a respectful distance from her door, and for the first time in all the years they'd passed each other on the road, Cal Hadley looked Nora Vance straight in the eye. Pale blue met steady gray, and held, and neither one looked away. There was a long silence, the kind that says more than words, filled only with the evening wind and the far-off lowing of cattle and the small creak of the leather hat brim turning slow in his nervous hands. He'd rehearsed something, you could tell. Proud men always do. They build their apologies like fences, rail by careful rail. But standing there in front of her, all the rehearsed words seemed to desert him, and what came out was plainer and truer for it. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was not the easy, certain voice he used in the trading yard, but lower, rougher, a man's voice when he's set down a thing he's carried too long. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, though I reckon it's near worthless this late. I had you figured wrong. I had you figured the way a fool figures, by the look of a thing and not the truth of it, and I called you names, in my mind, I'm ashamed to think on now. My men told me what you done, for the Sutter boy, for Wheeler, and I stood at my fence, and I couldn't even call your eyes to mind, and that shamed me worse than anything has shamed me in a long while." Nora did not answer right away. She let him stand in it, not cruelly, but because she was not a woman to rush a thing or to make it easier than it was. She studied him with those level gray eyes, and what she saw was not the proud man from the trading yard, but a man humbled, honest, and there's a great difference, and she knew it. Then she said, in that low, even voice, "You came up here to tell me that. Most men would have let it lie. It was not absolution exactly, and it was not warmth, but it was an opening, and Cal had the wit to step through it." He turned the hat once more in his hands and said there was sickness among his hired men, a fever going through the bunkhouse, 2 of them down bad, and that he'd come not just to apologize but to ask humbly, for he didn't know another word for it, whether she might come and look at them, and what he might do to square the debt. And Nora Vance, the plain, quiet woman he dismissed without a second glance, looked at the proud rancher standing hat in hand at her threshold, and something passed over her face that was not triumph and was not spite. "Let me get my chest," she said, and she turned back into the warm lamplit dark of her home to gather her tools, while behind her the most powerful man in the valley stood, waiting on her word, his hat in his hands, in the long gold light of the dying day. And so it was settled, the way the deepest things in this life are mostly settled, not with a flourish, but with a quiet turning of a key in a lock that had been jammed shut for years. Nora rode down to Cal's place that very evening and saw to his fevered men and broke the sickness in 2 days that might have carried both of them off, and Cal never again in his life spoke a careless word about a soul he hadn't troubled to know. But that's the after part of the story, and the after parts mostly tell themselves. The picture I want to leave you with is Nora herself, in the last slant of that golden hour, her face turned 3/4 to the dying light so that it caught along the high line of her cheek, and the thin pale scar beside her mouth, and kindled in those sharp gray eyes a kind of deep banked warmth. Behind her shoulder, soft and out of focus, hung the herb-drying rack, with its bundles of yarrow and sage stirring faint in the evening wind. And beyond that the valley lay open and wide, and gone all amber and rose, the whole hard, beautiful country she'd come to as a grieving stranger and had quietly, without ever meaning to, made her own. Her expression was settled. That's the only word I have for it, and it's the right one. Not triumphant. She took no pleasure in Cal Hadley's humbling, for she'd long ago made her peace with the small cruelties of small minds, and didn't need his apology to know her own worth. And not bitter. There was no rancor left in her, no old wound nursed and tended, only a calm that came from somewhere far below the reach of any man's opinion. She had not changed, you see. That's the thing folks miss when they tell this story. She was the same plain, quiet woman at the end that she'd been at the beginning. The same brown hands and level eyes and unhurried ways. The same covenant with the suffering. The valley had changed around her. Cal had changed, ground down and remade by the simple weight of a truth he couldn't outrun. But Nora had only kept doing the thing she'd always done, tying her yarrow and reading her journal and laying her hands on the broken and the fevered, asking nothing, expecting nothing, and in the asking of nothing. There's a lesson in that, friends, and I'll not insult you by laying it out too plain, for you've followed the trail this far, and you can read its meaning for yourselves. But I'll say this much the way it was said to me. The world is full of Cal Hadleys, men and women both, sure of the measure of everything and everyone, glancing past the quiet ones, the plain ones, the ones who don't talk much, certain there's nothing there worth the trouble of looking at. And the world is full, too, of Noras, of souls doing the deep, necessary work in the shade of the eve where the loud and the certain never think to look, building their fortresses of knowing against the dark. Take care which one you choose to be, and take greater care, still, when you pass a plain, quiet figure on some dusty road, that you do not tip your hat and ride on without ever once meeting their eyes. For you cannot know, you simply cannot know, what wisdom and what worth and what whole valleys of need are bound up in a soul you've been too sure of yourself to see. Nora Vance lived out her days on the North Fork, and when at last she passed, the whole of the valley came to her door one final time, and they buried her beside her Tom, and they did not forget her. And that, more than gold, more than land, more than a proud man's apology, is the truest measure of a life well spent. Good night, friends. Mind the fire, and mind your eyes.